Welcome to Conversations with Chamomile. This is your host, Jacob Lyles. Join me as we explore life together. Hi everyone, welcome back to the show. Today I have a conversation with Charlie Deist to share with you. Charlie's an old friend and he was a big influence on me when I was exploring Christianity myself. He's one of the friends that introduced me to Jordan Peterson, as well as inviting me to church with him when I was exploring Christianity. Charlie is a libertarian, and himself, he was an adult convert to Christianity and later to Catholicism. He's deeply influenced by the ideas of René Girard, which also were a big influence on me. And I think sometimes I gloss over the importance of René Girard in my own personal spiritual journey. We dive deep into that topic in this conversation, so I hope you enjoy that. And wishing you a Merry Christmas. Welcome, Charlie, to the podcast.
Good to see you, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you too. Thank you for being part of this series on spiritual journeys to faith. It's good to have a familiar face back on the show.
It's been too long. I feel like too much time passes between our conversations, but we always seem to jump right back into the thick of it. So let's roll.
Well, once every 2 years seems to be a good
cadence. More often than that.
Well, it should be more often than that, but I feel like that's what it is right now. Would you mind, for the folks tuning in, to sort of introduce yourself and anything you're doing online, to give them a flavor of who you are?
Yeah, sure. And I guess in the context of this conversation, I'll just start with the fact that I'm a Roman Catholic convert, and I joined the church in 2017. I, before that, was baptized in my early 20s. I think I was 23 when I was first baptized, and then I was maybe 27 or so, 28 when I became a Catholic. And it was not an easy journey for me to make that shift towards Roman Catholicism. I think for a lot of reasons. I grew up in the Bay Area my whole life, and always had a kind of contrarian attitude towards the prevailing norms in Berkeley. And you find that there's, kind of a general antipathy towards religion, and in particular towards Christianity. I would say that, maybe even with the exception of Christianity, the antipathy is fairly shallow, or not generally. It's kind of considered, uncouth to criticize someone's religion, unless it's Christianity, in which case it's completely fair game. But I never really, cracked open a Bible, or at least took it seriously, until after graduating from college. I went to school at UC Berkeley, studied economics, was very much a sort of secular libertarian, politically affiliated, and a lot of my identity came from that sort of contrarian political stance of being a libertarian. I also, by way of sort of introduction to my other interests, am a MoveNat certified trainer, which MoveNat is a branch of parkour kind of that takes place mostly outdoors in nature, and embraces the elements as a way of becoming stronger and staying healthy, just keeping yourself in close contact with the elements. And MoveNat has really become a bigger part of my identity. I think it's sort of a healthier affiliation than politics per se. But interestingly, the group that's coalesced around MoveNat in the East Bay turns out to be a very sort of freedom-oriented group of people. We started off with this focal point of meeting outdoors for this exercise group. And in the midst of the lockdowns of last year, we all realized that we all pretty much thought the same way about some of the kind of insanity of COVID and whatnot. And so I write a newsletter. My website is anaturalmethod.com, and that refers to the precursor to MoveNat, which was something called La Méthode Naturelle, developed by a French naval officer by the name of Georges Hebert. And he also originated the term parkour. So parkour and MoveNat are both from the same family that originates with the natural method. And if people are interested in following my writings, I kind of blend together a little bit of my spirituality, a little bit of the freedom politics, and also movement, health, and fitness from this perspective of how to live as a free human being in this modern era. Facilitate these cities on the ocean, startup societies for the furthering of human freedom and these experiments in liberty. Seeing how far we can take that thought experiment of giving people more choice, not just at the level of what they buy at the grocery store or which jurisdiction they live in, but actually being able to create new political jurisdictions where you could start your own society from scratch and write the rules to be whatever your vision of the good life or promoting the common good would be. Doesn't necessarily have to be a purely laissez-faire. You could have a seastead that has strict government policies about the health requirements, or making sure that people are getting adequate vitamin D in order to occupy that seastead, which I think would be a vast improvement over the current public health framework that we have, where it's sort of a lot of coercion without a whole lot of results. I think we could turn down the coercion a lot and focus on interventions that we actually know work. But I digress. I've opened up a number of can of worms, so I'm just going to leave it at that.
A Christian from the Bay Area, and kind of rare, I think, to be part of the conversation. I can definitely tell that you're a contrarian for going in that direction. And I believe that it was you and another friend of mine whose name I forgot at Ephemeral, which is kind of a seasteading festival, that introduced me to Jordan Peterson on my spiritual journey back in, I think, 2017, if I'm not mistaken.
That must have been Ben Brown.
Perhaps.
Who was a roommate of mine at a former convent in El Cerrito, just north of Berkeley. We lived together in this place that had been the place where the teachers for an elementary school that were nuns used to live. And then this convent just became, at one point it was grad student housing, and by a strange series of events, it just became this group house that I referred to as an unintentional community, because we all just sort of fell into it from different places, but we all did have some sort of connection to the church and different churches, but all within the broader Christian faith.
Now, maybe we should go ahead and start at the beginning of your story, Charlie. What was your spiritual background like growing up?
Yeah, and I have to sort of strain to remember what my first notions of God or religion really were. My parents didn't really talk very much about religion or God. They acknowledged God as a reality, but it wasn't really fleshed out any further than that. It wasn't, God in the person of Jesus Christ, even though they both were raised with some sort of Christianity. So I think that was probably the understanding that they had been given when they were growing up. And for whatever reason, conscious or unconscious, they decided not to pass on that part of their heritage. My mom stopped going to church, I believe, when she was 10 or 11, when shortly after her mom died. I think her family's just sort of that fell off the map, but she was raised Roman Catholic for the first 10 years of her life. I'm sure she received First Communion. My dad was more mainline Protestant, and his mom actually later in life became a born-again Christian. But I think my understanding is that their faith was fairly lukewarm, that they just sort of went through the motions, as was the norm in the Midwest suburbs of Chicago during the 1950s, 1960s. And so growing up, I hear people talk about going to church. I know that there are some kids in the class who maybe are it's not like a weird thing, but it was a little bit unusual to find a peer in Marin County who regularly went to church. Although one of my best friends, actually from first grade on, Katie Stewart, was one of these rarities. She and her family, they had, on their door, some, I think it was one of the Psalms, as for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord. And inside the house, you just kind of got the sense this was like a clean and cheerful Christian home. I don't know how else to put it, but it also was very warm and filled with love. And so that was some of my exposure to Christianity, was just through my friends, the Stewarts, and their parents were of a more of a Pentecostal sort of charismatic variety. But a couple times I went with them to their church and got a sense for this form of Protestant worship, which is, heavy on sort of singing, and you can kind of imagine like the arms in the air, and it had a feel good sense to it, but I wasn't really drawn in. And usually I was only there because I had, had a sleepover at their house the night before. And so it was just expected that I put on a clean shirt and go with them to church. And usually I was pretty eager to get out of there and do whatever else it was that I had in mind for the weekend. So, I mean, that was really my early introduction. Plus my Uncle Charlie, whose name I'm named for him. That's my mom's brother. He returned to the Roman Catholic faith of his childhood, raised his family that way. And so a couple times I went to Mass, and I think my impressions of Mass were a lot of kneeling, a lot of sitting down, standing up, just kind of, going through the motions, and again, waiting for it to be over. And thinking to myself, I don't believe in God. What is this God character? If God is real, why doesn't, then let's see if he's going to punish me when I think to myself, I don't believe in God. Or what if I even say it out loud? I don't believe in God. I would whisper it under my breath and see if anything would happen, just to kind of test out this hypothesis that God was an active reality who would immediately intervene if I did something to contradict him. That was one of my first recollections of my budding atheism/agnosticism.
Yes, so it seems like you had an innate sense of sort of the scientific method from a young age. You're like, let me test out this God character, see if he's there.
Yeah, just in the same way that a kid tests out their parents. I don't know if it was even so sophisticated as the scientific method, but just pushing the boundaries a little bit and seeing what would happen. Well, if I can do this, what about this? I don't really remember having much of a sense of sin either. I think that my childhood was fairly innocent, and outside of a few peccadillos, I wasn't really getting into serious trouble. So I didn't see much of a need for like a God to keep me in line. I felt like, my parents acted as my externalized conscience until I was old enough to have a little bit of my own conscience. But, later on that would start to get me into trouble when my own conscience either wasn't sufficient or, the temptations of the flesh just became too strong.
Did you guys celebrate Christmas and Easter or anything like that?
We did. We celebrated Christmas and Easter in the secular Hallmark fashion of Easter egg hunts and stockings and Christmas trees. And those were festive times. Christmas more so. Easter was just really the day of, whereas Christmas was a season where my sister and I would talk about getting into the Christmas spirit, which usually just meant it felt like, winter time. Didn't really have anything to do with the biblical narrative of the incarnation or the wise men. That imagery was in my house, I'm sure. And I attribute some of the graces of that season to the whatever remained intact from the sort of living tradition of the church. But I think that for me, it was still mostly just about, the presents and the candy and a time of getting together with family. Nothing wrong with any of those things. Then I think it was maybe I was in middle school or high school when my grandma, the one who had the born again conversion, started to bring a book about, it was called The Worst or something like the worst Christmas pageant ever. It was about these like a school that put on a play about a Christmas pageant, and this like homeless or this like very marginal family with a bunch of really bad kids all auditioned for the play, and in the course of the experience, they all sort of have this conversion experience and become less rotten kids. And we loved that book when my grandma would read it. It was kind of fun. And that was another little early glimpse of like what this message of redemption was about. But at that time, I still didn't really have a frame of reference for sin or redemption or the need for it, because I was still a pretty good kid, not having existential crises. And so it was just, the story of these rotten kids where it's like, yeah, okay, I could see how maybe they need some redemption there.
So could you maybe explain a little bit, like, how did your sense of religion or spirituality evolve as you grew up?
Right. Okay. I'd say that I shifted from probably my atheist period peaked in middle school. That impish testing of boundaries and the desire to really just create my own way through life. By high school, I think I'd become more agnostic. I don't remember having really any sense of spirituality. I liked being out in nature. Nature, gave me a sense of awe and wonder. But I basically was operating within a materialistic framework. I had a rich sort of imagination and desire to live in fantasy worlds, which was expressed through things like watching anime and reading comic books or Lord of the Rings. I would get obsessed. I would just really fixate on these rich worlds that had been created by people. And that was, I think, the closest thing to transcendence that I experienced was through imagination and kind of play. Me and my friends would go out into the mountains of or hills and mountains of Marin County and just do these elaborate make-believe type stunts. And that's really all that I remember of spirituality. But I lived in my head, and I liked this world of ideas, and I was politically engaged. And so I started to think about politics through the lens of, different ideas of morality. I skewed more to the conservative side, which you might think would have disposed me to be more open to a religious message. But I still, none of it really resonated. It was just something that, other people who shared my politics happened to also believe. Then in college, I really embraced this libertarian identity. I remember there was another guy in the libertarian club named Andre, who was this big guy and super outspoken and pretty eloquent. And he would kind of go on these apologetic rants about Christianity, because he was a Christian and could defend it well. But I remember, it's kind of funny to look back on this, because I remember asking him some questions, some kind of gotcha type questions about, whether he believed that, anyone who didn't believe what he believed was going to hell. And if that was the case, then why wasn't every minute of the day spent? Well, just all these things that I could use in my mind to degrade the sincerity of his beliefs and make it out so that I didn't have to actually wrestle with the ideas themselves.
Sounds like you were trying to poke holes or push at it as much as possible.
Yeah, but without ever engaging with any sort of serious proponents or having really read anything that other than, the sort of middle school atheist debunkings of religion. And I'll include in that the likes of Richard Dawkins and Sam Hitchens, or what's his name? Sam
Hitchens.
Christopher Hitchens was.
Yes,
I enjoyed Christopher Hitchens' writing, but
Richard Sam Hitchens, something.
Yeah,
those guys. Richard Sam
of
Hitchens Dennett.
New atheism.
Yeah, not the first time they've been name dropped in this podcast, in its podcast series in its infancy so far. it seemed to be a common phase. A lot of us that grew up in like the early 2000s kind of ran into.
Yeah, I would say that of those three, I enjoyed reading Christopher Hitchens because he at least had a certain wit. I remember reading Sam Harris's book. I forget what it was called, but basically he was kind of conflating, fundamentalist Islam with fundamentalist Christianity, with all Christianity, and basically saying that, if you're a Christian, you support the, stoning of women and homosexuals to death because, you have to believe to the letter everything that you find in the Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah. My church hasn't scheduled a stoning in quite some time.
Yeah. But you got to really go back in the.
I mean, it does seem like he might be like 2,500 years out of date with that particular view of Christianity. But
yeah, and I think that this gets to the idea of like how you read scripture depends on what you're using as your interpretive key. And I remember through studying economics, I came across one obscure branch of Austrian economics that tried to use hermeneutics, which is basically like a way of interpreting where you look at the whole through the lens of the individual parts, and you have to look at the individual parts through the lens of the whole, and through this iterative process, you kind of find your way to an understanding of a system or a text. And I think that when it comes to scripture, if you read the whole of scripture honestly, then you can't possibly come away believing that the essence of the Bible is the legal codes found in Leviticus that were given to the people of Israel at a very specific time in their history.
So I just want to make sure that we set a milepost here, so we're clear at like where you were at. It sounds like your college identity was mostly wrapped around libertarianism and your political ideals, but not. And would you still describe yourself as agnostic and maybe a little skeptical at this point? It sounds like.
And materialist, like fundamentally materialist. And the things that I valued most were still, material. I didn't necessarily want to be rich, but I put a very high premium on enjoying this life and enjoying, finding happiness in sort of the things of this world. And as a result of that, I think that that led me into a pretty deep depressive funk for a big chunk of college, where I was anxious and didn't really know why.
So why is that? Like I've heard this go together with other people too. It's like I was a materialist and I got depressed. Why do those two things seem to go together so much?
When you stare into the abyss stares back into you. I don't know. There's just something about I don't know if it's the nature of desire, seeking something to satisfy it, and then finding that everything that you try to stuff into the desire hole ends up leaving you feeling a little bit more dry than before. And so my freshman year of college was a particularly kind of pivotal moment where I suddenly, really everything in my life was going great. I had the meal plan. You've got this freedom from your parents. You're experimenting with alcohol and drugs and having a good time, and no one's looking over your shoulder. There was the file sharing app on campus where you could download any TV show or movie that you wanted, and really even beyond that, my group of friends was great. I was in a relationship that by all appearances should have been fulfilling and making me happy according to the standards of society. But one day I had this thought, and it had been a thought that had cropped up from time to time, and I usually could just sort of file it away as this oddity of my brain, but it wouldn't go away this time. And it was the thought that I would remain stuck in my head, thinking about the fact that I'm thinking about the fact that I'm thinking about the fact, And this infinite regress, or this loop of sort of OCD without any kind of compulsion to really satisfy it, started to really concern me until it became like a full-blown anxiety disorder that prevented me from enjoying anything from going to the movies, or even just sitting through a lecture. I stopped being able to enjoy going to parties. I almost had to drop out of school because it was such a burden. And I think that if I really drill down into it, I can find at the root of it that it wasn't really anxiety about being stuck in my head. It was anxiety about being stuck with an identity that was, sort of superficial, that was, I'll just say it, like living in sin. If I had died at that moment, I would have died in my sins. And maybe, I hope, I pray that that I'm not living in mortal sin as we speak, and that's why we have things like confession and ways to well, again, I digress, but I do think that there is this reality of our condition being such that if we die at a particular time, having not heeded what was oftentimes an abundance of warnings that we were not living in accord with God's plan for our life, then that's the ultimate tragedy. And that's really like the fate that everyone should be trying to avoid to some extent. Not to say that we should live every minute of our lives. That can become its own sort of neurosis, like constantly checking to see whether, oh, did I just sin? And that's called scrupulosity. And that's something that I've also sort of struggled with at times. But I think that having heard but not internalized a little bit about the Gospels and another way to live, which would be more forthright and more honest about the effects that my behaviors were having on other people and myself. I think that it manifested as this surface phenomenon of obsessive thoughts, but beneath that was really an anxiety about the lifestyle of the average college student.
It sounds like a lot of suffering, this anxiety disorder that you're kind of developing.
Huge, and
and kind of like derailing too. Like everything else is going fine, and then you have like this thing tap on your shoulder and kind of surprise you.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about first world problems. This was the epitome of first world problems, and I couldn't explain it to people because it seemed like such a trivial problem. Oh, you're thinking about something that is abstract and you can't stop. Why not? Why don't you just stop thinking about it? Why don't you think about something else? But to me, this was the most pressing problem in the world. Like why I was so fixated on it, and I never really discovered an answer in terms of I was never able to think my way out of that problem. But I did have another epiphany. Sort of, I developed different strategies for dealing with it, and they were by and large just finding compelling things to capture my attention, better and better distractions. But I did have an epiphany, I think my junior year of college, that the purpose of life is to be lived, and that we get this opportunity to set our values and then live in accordance with those values. And so if be kind of a utility, fulfilling a utility function according to our own values, and trying to maximize that utility function, which was still a materialist framework, but it had just enough of a sort of mystical flavor to it that it became my own personal spirituality for the next few years.
It almost sounds a little Nietzschean. It's like this defining your own values and
a little bit of that. And I hadn't read Nietzsche, although I got this sense from reading the Austrian economists, and particularly Mises, that purposeful action is the unique faculty of our rationality, and that we, or rather that not. Let me be more precise, because I think that I would be doing Mises a disservice if I put it that way. human action is purposeful action. That's the famous line from his magnum opus, and he elaborates this to encompass the whole set of economic axioms and principles, where we use our rationality as the instrument to achieve our ends. So rationality is sort of what is the means for, or it's the means for selecting our means to achieve our ends. And that did resonate with me, that like I have that my thoughts are not just there to be sort of enjoyed like a daydream, like a fantasy world, that they're actually there to get me somewhere. And so then the question becomes, well, where do I actually want to go? And you can reshape that over time, but if you're working towards something, then you're a lot less likely to be stuck in your head.
So did this phase sort of last through the rest of college? Did this take you through college?
Pretty much took me through college. I had a couple other hiccups.
Were you wrestling with this anxiety the whole time, or were some of these ideas sufficient to start?
I had breakthroughs, and I also, as a sort of confessional addition here, I was smoking copious amounts of marijuana as a way to put myself into a state of mind where I could just sort of get into a little bit of a flow and a hedonic state. My senior year, I went through a kind of rough breakup, and then really just buried myself in my senior thesis, combined with smoking a lot of marijuana. Had kind of a paranoid episode. And incidentally, it was in that last semester of college that I feel like the signs, kind of like, signs from God started to manifest. Even though I can identify that it was dovetailing with my paranoia, they still directed me eventually out of that paranoia, but also through the path of God in Christ, in the person of Jesus Christ. And that is something that I
so I mean, I lost like a second of audio.
Okay.
What were the signs?
Well, I didn't talk about the signs, and they,
sorry.
some of them would sound kind of, I think, might sound crazy and at the time it was like I was really sort of wrestling with my sanity, but it was gosh, let's see. Well, on the one hand, there was there were moments of clarity when I realized the need to sort of surrender from this state of just like feeling like there were that there were so many powers at play in the world and in my life that were beyond my control, having to surrender those, and then finding an experience of peace, and realizing that in order to surrender them, I had to be sort of surrendering them to someone or something. It's what the 12-step programs would call a higher power, before I had really committed to the idea of a God who I could relate to as a human being in the person of Jesus Christ. There was this surrendering to just a vague higher power. And I think that really was the first time I had done that. Even in the earlier periods of anxiety and dealing with the obsessive thoughts, I might have also caught some glimpses of that, but it was mostly, I think there was mostly a failure to surrender in those earlier periods. Whereas my senior year, I'm about to sort of be unleashed into the real world, and I had probably a lot of anxiety about that as well, and just had to say, I'm going to let this go, put it in God's hands, and see what happens.
Now, this idea of well, first of all, just about the marijuana thing, I think a lot of people are self-medicating with drug and alcohol use. Like, I think that's fairly common. Maybe there's like two common motivations for drug and alcohol use. One is fun and like general like sort of sensation exploration, and I think the other one is self-medication. people trying to correct something that's wrong with them, although it's not the healthiest way, and these things have side effects. But I mean, that's kind of would you agree with that? Or
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in the early days it was fun. It seemed to kind of help me tap into certain creative potential. With alcohol, I think that it's true that a lot of people live in a almost constant state of social anxiety and second guessing everything that they're doing. And with alcohol, they get a temporary reprieve from that. And in a social environment, it can be actually, I think, pretty liberating. And I think that was sort of part of what goes along with, the college experience, and why it in some ways can be valuable, is to get people to learn, who they are in an environment that's relatively safe. Although, clearly the levels of binge drinking and drug and alcohol abuse that go on are not safe for some people. Some people don't make it out okay. And I came out of college with a pretty bad pot habit that persisted for on and off another 6 or 7 years, even after the period of my initial conversion to Christianity, and after I stopped getting blackout drunk and doing things like that. Felt like with marijuana there was a little more gray area where I could get away with doing this, but I increasingly would do it in isolation to do just what you're saying, which is numb myself, or just kind of paper over whatever issues I didn't want to look at or address.
Yeah, they call that, it's like a very uniquely Californian point of view, I think, or at least like blue state point of view, that alcohol, that could be problematic. I want to watch that, but marijuana is like a lesser, or a much lesser thing to worry about. There's this phrase California sober, where someone will say, I'm California sober, which means I don't drink.
Right.
But this idea of surrendering to a higher power, was that like in the zeitgeist around you? Did you pick that up from, like, how did you know that was a thing you could do?
Good question. I never went to any sort of 12-step meetings. I think that it sort of does trickle down into the culture, that the idea of letting go, and even into psychology as a sort of substitute for faith, where you could probably find a lot of secular psychology saying the same thing about the need to focus on the things that you can control, and trust in a higher power to take care of the things that you can't control. This was also around the time of it was a few years after the financial crisis, and in my mind it feels like 2011 was like the peak of insanity, right when I was graduating. But looking back, I think that was probably a projection of my own internal state, rather than what was actually happening in the world.
You started to have Occupy Wall Street at that time. The Trayvon Martin case was like 2012. I mean, I think the economy is starting to recover pretty strongly by 2011, but definitely there was something in the air with like Occupy and all that.
Yeah. But soon after graduating, I went to work at the Seasteading Institute, which had been kind of a long time dream of mine, or at least a year or more. I'd been following seasteading as a sort of salvation from the political systems that I still view as increasingly precarious. So the idea of working, using reason and whatnot instrumentally toward the goal of freedom on the high seas, or through some alternative kind of governance, that gave me enough motivation to kind of keep on trucking. And it was somewhat through seasteading that I discovered the writings of René Girard, who figures into my conversion pretty prominently, because Peter Thiel, who had sort of spawned, along with Patri Friedman, this Seasteading Institute thought experiment, was a student of René Girard when he was an undergraduate at Stanford, and then had supported the ideas of René Girard philanthropically through this organization called Imitatio. And so I started reading, I think first just some of the free PDFs that were available on the Imitatio website. And Girard had this pretty, incredible to me thesis about the nature of the Gospels, which I still had not really read. The Gospels being subversive to religious myth, archaic religious myths that tend to portray God as some sort of or the deity, plural or singular, as these victims of a collective violence, and that the God only becomes God after they are sort of violently expelled, and in the wake of that expulsion, where the whole community comes together against this figure. That's really the piece that results from that unity against the scapegoat, as it were, is what leads to the divinization of the deity. And what's missing from the archaic myths is the recognition or the awareness that there's a scapegoating process going on. And so Girard, being both an anthropologist and a literary critic, takes all of these texts that are at the foundations of different religions from around the world, and finds that this would have been a very good way for a fragile human society to patch itself up after all of its rivalries and internal strife starts to pile up. That this is really kind of the only way for a collective to survive, unless they, of course, would do the much more difficult alternative of actually loving one another and following what we would now call kind of the gospel admonition to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But until humanity can actually, whether it's humanity or individuals that compose all of humanity, until we all are able to actually reach that higher level, the best way of dealing with our conflict is to pin it all on an easy scapegoat. And so Girard has this really compelling explanation for how religious rituals, and then along with it, the prohibitions and taboos that accompany any sort of religious system, the whole matrix of religion, come into being. And so that was compelling to me. And Girard was also a practicing Catholic. And so I recognized that there might be something here, broke through that intellectual barrier that I had to reading scripture and looking for a interpretive key that would make sense, rather than reading it to try to debunk it and ritually desecrate it along with the rest of secular society.
Yeah, I learned about René Girard through Peter Thiel as well. And he was, I think it was kind of in the background when I was exploring Christianity. Like I had those ideas in my head, and they were useful. I was trying to remember like when the popular culture started, or Peter Thiel started really talking about it in the popular culture, to the extent that it was other like people outside of his immediate circle were talking about it. I found an interview he did around 2014, I think, for the launch of his book 0 to 1, where he talks about René Girard quite a bit. The earliest thing I can find from him on the internet with a quick Googling is 2009, him in a YouTube video talking about it. Apparently he was organizing symposiums at Stanford to talk about it in 2004. So it's been something that's been with him for a very long time. And he studied René Girard in grad school, which I think would have been probably sometime in the 90s.
I think it was just as an undergrad, because I think he went to law school, and then I don't know if he did any other graduate work, but I think that they remain friends or had some sort of correspondence after that. And I would be curious to know what the class was that he took as an undergrad, whether it was some anthropology thing or literature class. And I still am coming back to Girard as someone who I've just scratched the surface I've read a lot of his work, but just yesterday I was actually reading an article where he's sort of deconstructing Nietzsche's essay called it's one of the, I think it's a chapter or a section of one of Nietzsche's books called Dionysus versus the Crucified, and he takes as his jumping off point the fact that most secular critics of Christianity like to point out the similarities between Christianity and every other religion. So they'll point to the fact that, you know, both Christ and Dionysus were sort of expelled, or you know, they're looking for ways to say that all religions spring from the same archetypes and that there's nothing unique about Christianity. And Nietzsche actually saw through this and recognized that there was something unique about Christianity. Nietzsche thought that it was uniquely perverse in a sense, that it encouraged a sort of resentment as a form of weakened vengeance, and that it's, you know, it's the slave morality as opposed to the master morality and whatnot. But Girard, what was really fascinating in this article is he's talking about how Nietzsche himself was the poster child in a way for this resentment, or the French ressentiment. I don't know how you say it in French, but that fancy version of the word, where Nietzsche realized that he tried, especially later in his life when he was starting to go mad, that the alternative to Christianity is, you know, re-embracing violence in as the sacred, that violence is the sort of organizing principle of the sacred, which it has been for most of history. And even in Judaism, and even to some extent in Christianity, you have like a violent scapegoating, or, you know, ritual sacrifice at the center of the religion. But what differentiates Judaism and Christianity is this increasing awareness that that's not actually a viable path forward. And in a world with nuclear weapons and all this new technology, to embrace, you know, violence as the sacred would mean, you know, the utter annihilation of the planet. So as Nietzsche gets closer and closer to actually embracing the final conclusion of rejecting the Gospels, he starts to go more and more insane.
Way. Interesting to me that Girard, you know, he converted to Christianity himself while he was building his philosophical system. Like, sort of the conclusion that he couldn't escape from his research and his studies was that Christianity had something unique about it that was uniquely compelling. And eventually he convinced himself of the truth of it. And that is telling, considering how many people nowadays are coming to Christianity through Girard, especially very thoughtful people. They find his arguments convincing, just like as he found his own arguments convincing, and put his skin in the game.
Yeah, there's this new book. I haven't read it yet, but I've been seeing it everywhere, by Luke Burgess, called Wanting: The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. And I guess, I mean, I didn't mention mimetic desire, but that's the other of the sort of twin theories that Girard popularized, with one being the scapegoating mechanism of generating a religious matrix, and then the other is mimetic desire as the engine for all of the rivalries, where humans have this capacity to imitate each other. They also have the capacity to share a very intense desire for the same objects. And so if I see that, you know, you've got some really hot new car, then I might try to get that same car, especially if I see that other people are flocking to you because of that car. And if there's only one car, then we're going to have a problem. And it might get violent after a certain point. But I think that this book and the popularity of it also speaks to a sense in modernity that we have all this new wealth, but desire remains a problem in terms of, you know, what do we ultimately want? And are we just pursuing consumption for the sake of status and becoming the alpha, or are we actually finding fulfillment in something that we intrinsically desire because of its goodness, or because of something about, ourselves that is meant to have this thing? Or I don't know, but
desire plus scarcity equals conflict, or mimetic desire plus scarcity equals conflict. And the only way that I think mimetic desire can ultimately be filled is by something that's not scarce, which is certainly in the Christian worldview is God, who multiplies himself like the 5 loaves.
Right.
It's like there's blessings enough for all.
It's interesting because I'm thinking that like it's very rare, or I haven't heard very many. And I think that for an authentic convert, if they realize that all of their friends are suddenly finding fulfillment in Christ or in the Gospels, it's going to be very rare that someone experiences envy around that. I guess it's possible if you're going through a period of dryness and someone that you introduce to the Gospels is suddenly finding that they're having this new revival in their life, you might experience some envy. But I think in general, the authentic disciple is very happy to see other people find what they have found. And there's no greater gift that I could imagine for my friends and peers than for them to come to know the peace that I've found through this. And I didn't even really get into the period or the story of how I found my way into the church, but that was not long after I started working at the Seasteading Institute and reading Girard, and reading in particular a lot of his acolytes and people who have been inspired by his theories, to theologians and pastors. Who elaborate on this.
Just briefly for the listeners, would you recommend like either a starting point into Girard or some materials from him or his acolytes that you found particularly useful to digest his ideas?
Yeah, the best starting place I think is a radio series that a guy named David Cayley did for the Canadian Broadcast Company's show, the Ideas, and it's called The Ideas of René Girard. And I actually reached out to Cayley because I noticed that he had created little books out of some of his other interview series. He did a couple of series with another Catholic theologian and priest named Ivan Illich that I'd enjoyed those series also. And so I asked him if he'd be willing to work with me on turning this series of interviews, some with Girard and some with other people who were influenced by Girard, turning that into a little book. And that's available on Amazon if you just search The Ideas of René Girard. I think I make like $2 every time you buy it, but we priced it to be, I think it's like $7 for a paperback, which is about as low as it can go on Amazon. And it's a slim little volume. I don't have a copy here, but it features a handful of Girardians discussing these ideas from different perspectives. And it was originally a 5-hour series, so it compresses into about a 120-page book that you can read in an afternoon or two.
Great. I think that's a good starting point for people. So we'll put that out there. If I remember, I'll put a link in the description to the video.
I'm proud of that book, actually, even though I didn't have anything. I just formatted it for Amazon. But I do think that in terms of things that I've done in my life that maybe have moved the lever a little bit, or actually changed some people's minds or gotten them to think in a different way, that might be close to the top of the list.
That's great. Yeah, it's a very personal touch here at Conversations with Chamomile. My guests can recommend their own books. It's a
but
cozy...
David Cayley, all glory to God. Second David Cayley.
Yeah,
maybe René Girard should be in there somewhere too. But bless his memory, because he passed away just a few years ago. Girard did.
Yeah. Yeah. So why don't you take us through? It sounds like you're starting to come to come closer to the Christian faith at this time in your life. How old would you say you are?
22, 23. This was back
Just a
in,
couple years out of college.
yeah, this was around 2011, 2012. And yes, so through Girard, I start to read scripture and take it more seriously. And at that point, I sort of branched out and was looking for more perspective on the, I don't know, the historicity of the Gospels, or trying to figure out, okay, well, if this is true, in what sense is it true? Was Jesus a real person? Were these really his words? And diving into some of the source material for the Gospels, realizing that there was actually a book of sayings, most likely is the hypothetical Q source, or Quella, I think is German for source, and that was hypothesized to be a book of sayings that at least the authors of the three synoptic Gospels all used in compiling the final work. And so it seems like, okay, this checks out. Like there actually was a person named Jesus, or Yeshua, who lived and walked the earth and taught this way. He was crucified, and then there are all these accounts of communities witnessing to the resurrection in different forms. So at that point, I didn't have any kind of denominational affiliations. I read a lot of the sermons, archived sermons of a pastor named Robert Hamerton Kelly. And he was, I think, the chaplain at Stanford for a while. And I think he was Methodist, which doesn't really matter. Point is, here was a highly educated and eloquent homilist, or his homilies had real meat on them, and he would have series of homilies on specific subjects like the prophets, or the histories of the Old Testament. And so that kind of got me situated in reading the Bible with some commentary. And I do think that for someone who's who wasn't brought up with the Word of God being read to them aloud in church with a homily here, and I think the lectionary of the church tends to present scripture in a way that's much more digestible than if you just sit down and try to read it cover to cover. If you do that, you get into Leviticus, and all of a sudden you're ready to switch over to Sam Harris's team, because there's a lot of stuff that just meets our modern perspective with some uncomfortable seeming conclusions. But Hamerton Kelly did I think a really good job of presenting the Gospels in a light that made sense historically, fit in with my budding understanding of human nature and mimetic rivalry, and the tendency of human beings to create idols. So this was a period where I was starting to consider, what are the idols in my own life? And alcohol, going out drinking, and sort of the culture of promiscuity that I, was just the context of a young person in Berkeley in the year 2011, 2012, started questioning, like, what are the things that I ultimately desire and why? And the things that survived that period, things like seasteading and natural movement. I started sailing around that time. Those are things that I still continue to enjoy to this day. And I don't think that they were particularly motivated by, they weren't mediated by a third party like a lot of mimetic desire. They were really things that I discovered that I enjoyed.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught in the trap of, pursuing what's prestigious instead of like what's really good. I think that's the path a lot of people go down. And Peter Thiel's talked about that too, like his path after law school, he clerked for the Supreme Court and graduated from a prestigious law school. And he says, from the outside, everyone wants to get in, and on the inside, everyone's miserable. And that's sort of the trap that mimetic desire kind of can put you in, like this competition, zero-sum competition for scarce resources is hellish. But it's so it sounds like you're at this point you're satisfying like some of your also you still have some of this like, I don't know, scientific kind of worldview, right? Where you're testing out the truths of the Gospels. Like you have to know that this Jesus guy was real and not something made up, at least to some extent. I don't think he can be historically proven, like to the extent that we could prove something that happened less than 100 years ago. But there is evidence for him existing.
Right. Yeah. And I remember there was another talk or a podcast, something that I was listening to, a preacher, much more of a sort of mainline preacher. I think it was Timothy Keller, who's a Presbyterian minister in New York City with a large, thriving flock there. And he has
Redeemer.
Redeemer. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know much about the Presbyterian world, but I know Tim Keller's a big guy.
Yeah, and I did end up actually becoming baptized in the Presbyterian Church in 2013. I found a church in Berkeley that just felt warm, and the first time I went was Maundy Thursday, I think, of 2013, right before Easter, and there was some fellowship afterwards. And I met a guy, Caleb Brown, actually, Ben Brown's older brother, who ended up inviting me to live in the convent some years later, who we got into a conversation, and he was studying theology at the GTU in Berkeley, Graduate Theological Union. And I mentioned that I had been kind of exploring Christianity, and I don't know, I probably was sort of sputtering nonsense about it. Like, oh, there's this guy, René Girard, because I felt like I had to justify why I was there. Like these people would think I was weird for being there otherwise. And he's like, oh yeah, René Girard. Like I do I've got this film analysis where I use Girard to talk about The Departed, or I don't know, something like that. So I felt like I was in the right place because it was an intellectual environment.
What brought you there in the first place? Like what brought you through the doors the first time?
Actually, it was my sister who was going to a sister church. It might have even been somewhat related to Redeemer somehow, although I'm not sure. No, I don't think so, but a church in the city. We had been talking, and actually initially when I first started to talk to her about Christianity, she was really scandalized and thought that I was going crazy or doing something weird, and she and my parents were kind of like wondering if they needed to intervene. But then my sister has a sort of similar experience of feeling just dryness about her modern everyday life. And so she starts seeking out. She actually mustered the courage to go attend a church before I ever did. And then we found that the sister church in Berkeley, that's kind of the long story short.
But so you're coming to this church and you feel at home there, and how long and how did it come about that you got baptized?
Okay, so it was, yeah, well, let's see. And actually, when I just told that last story, I said that it was Maundy Thursday of 2013, but it must have been 2012 because it wasn't until the following Easter that I was baptized. And I started going to Christ Church regularly, sometimes with my sister, sometimes by myself. I got involved in some fellowship and increasingly just sort of felt the tug of the Holy Spirit that I wanted to make a public confession of faith. And it wasn't really that hard of a decision to make at that point. There was a little bit of a sense that this was like, the point of no return, and that, if I had wanted to go back to some of my previous lifestyles, then this would be like a kind of conclusive barrier. But I think that that's kind of part of the point, is that it's in the Catholic Church, and I'm sure also, well, actually I shouldn't speak for the Orthodox, but I think that it's considered a sacrament where the outward sign sort of symbolizes an inward reality. And so by standing up in front of the congregation, and in the Presbyterian Church, and you basically just have water sprinkled on your head, but you renounce Satan and all of his works, and you embrace Jesus Christ as your savior, and you say it in front of everybody. So it becomes a reality.
I mean, very much like a marriage ceremony, is an outward sign of but there's something real that happens, in a marriage. There's like a socially perceived. You can view it on a few levels. Like on a social level, like everyone sees that these two people are together. On an ontological level or spiritual level, like we believe like there is some, divinely mediated link that between these two people now. I think baptism is very similar in that way.
Definitely. Yeah. And I wasn't necessarily it wasn't like suddenly I came out of that feeling the sense of, it wasn't like, oh, I saw the heavens part or anything like that. But I think that it changed my general outlook, at least for a while, because there is another chapter in this before I reached the Catholic Church where I had a little bit of a falling away from the church. I moved from the West Coast to the East Coast in 2015 after being.
I just want to comment on two things that I heard that were interesting to me before we jump into the next chapter, if I can. Although I'm aware of the fact that maybe I'm going a little leisurely through this. My apologies. But one is the sense of like, it felt like almost embarrassment when you first came into the church, like you needed to justify why you were there. Like, would you, that strikes me as something familiar. Like when I started coming into the church, there was a sense that it was uncomfortable in my old social context, like in my non-Christian context. And still to this day, like when I meet up with like people I knew in the Bay that knew me before I was a Christian, like I think they're like, oh, are you, what? You're like a Christian now? That's kind of a strange thing. And I feel like a little, like I feel the dissonance there. And I felt it a lot when I was first coming in and like adopting this new faith in this new social context. And then the feeling of no going back was also very familiar to me. Like I think you can go back, but it won't be the same. It won't taste the same. Like your old vices probably won't give you the same juice that they gave you before you came into the church, because you have a different perspective on them. That's my take on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's extremely well put. That the sins sort of lose their savor, and not all of them, and not overnight. And like I said before, I continued to struggle in particular with marijuana as an addiction, and then I took that with me to the East Coast, and before long I was sort of back into the thick of it there. I did belong to a non-denominational church community for a while. First, I was in Washington, D.C., and I found this place. It was, I think I might have seen like an ad on. No, I think I Googled. I was looking for a church. I don't remember what search criteria I put in, but this was kind of like a hip new church. They had really good coffee before each service, and so it's kind of like, come for the coffee, stay for the gospel. And in general, they preached the gospel. This was a little bit before what I feel like was the tsunami wave of wokeness. This was 2015, and
so like presidential primaries are going on soon.
Not yet.
Okay.
This was before that. And if they were, then it wasn't really on my radar. I feel like it was
like
this was actually 2014. This was 2014.
Okay.
And there was a mix of really all kinds of people, but it was predominantly young people at this church. And so I kind of had a little bit of a split identity with the friends that I had made in DC before finding this church. And then I went on like a retreat with this church, but I didn't really, commit to putting all my eggs in the basket of this social group, and the church itself really did have like a fairly tight knit community, and I wasn't really part of the inner circle. Like if I had stuck around in DC longer, maybe I would have been, but then I quit the job that I had taken in DC, and I moved up to Brooklyn, where again I was sort of free floating for a while, and once I was in Brooklyn, I really never found any place that I would call home.
In this period of time, so you don't have as strong of a church group, did you drift away from the faith? Was it hard to keep like in touch with your Christian identity?
Yeah, it was, and I think that this is why the church exists. And I think that there's the short version and the long version, and depending on how much detail you want me to go into, I mean, I'd be happy to even make another appointment. This is like it's like therapy for me in a way to just go over all these old experiences, but the short version is that I never really planted any roots in New York City. I dabbled here and there. I think I might have checked out Redeemer at one point, but they were situated in Manhattan. And I think I only went to Manhattan like a dozen times the entire time I lived in Brooklyn. But I was also exploring different branches of the Orthodox Church. I went to an Antiochian Orthodox parish. When I was in DC, I had visited a Greek Orthodox parish a couple of times. That was within somewhat walking distance to my house. But these places always felt like kind of ethnic clubs with liturgy, with a beautiful liturgy. I didn't get a sense that there was like a community that I could belong to. So that kind of sets the stage for when I eventually moved back to the Bay Area, and found myself kind of a little bit strung out from this period of being in New York, unmoored from any community, and again I mean, just old habits creeping back in.
So the East Coast is where you go to get strung out and separated from your faith.
Right. It's an inversion of the usual story.
Yeah. DC and New York. I mean, I can certainly see how it would be difficult to live Christian life in such crowded, and ambitious places.
No, that's true. And actually, maybe I should put it differently. I think that the cities have typically been characterized as the more perilous places, but the West Coast does have its reputation as
it does, for sure.
But for me, it's home, and at least for now.
And West Coast is where you came to faith in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you flee the big city. In this
back
case,
to Berkeley. Yeah.
Back to the righteous homeland of
Berkeley.
Berkeley.
Back to Berkeley. I took up sailing again, and sailing was part of my kind of recovery. But then the other part was
when you say was this just a lot more marijuana?
Yeah. And I also found a 12-step group, Marijuana Anonymous, which played a huge role in recovering the just baseline level of feeling comfortable in my skin that I had lost from such heavy usage, in particular in that time when I was in New York, but really going back, 5 or 6 years from my junior year of college when I had started smoking really heavily.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about this, because so few people today would even have a concept of like any amount of marijuana use being a problem. Like it has such positive press in so much of like the liberal world, that it's the idea that there is a Marijuana Anonymous, and people that struggle with it and are trying to get away from it so they can naturally feel comfortable in their skin without using it as a crutch. It's kind of might be unusual for people to hear.
Well, that's if the first takeaway that I want people to get is to read the ideas of René Girard, then the second takeaway would be that if you have ever struggled, I'm speaking to the hypothetical listener right now, that if you have ever struggled with marijuana, then there is hope to be found in the 12-step fellowship. And whether you have an MA fellowship near you, or even I think a lot of AA fellowships are still a place where marijuana addicts can find a home. The disappointing thing has been, since the beginning of COVID, there haven't been any in-person meetings, and I consider that in-person fellowship to be pretty essential to the recovery process, because it's really, I think, about developing an identity which becomes incompatible with the old way that you lived your life. And so in the process of going to meetings and saying at every meeting, my name is so and so and I'm a marijuana addict, and then hearing these stories, telling stories, maybe taking a service position, suddenly your identity becomes someone who belongs to a group of people with a common problem, the addiction. And in the same way, I think that the church is kind of like a 12-step fellowship just for sinners anonymous, where you develop this identity of a kind of contrite person who bears the responsibility for, in some sense, all of what's wrong with humanity. G.K. Chesterton was once asked, or let me think, what's wrong with the world, and he said, I am. And that recognition that we're never going to solve the world's problems with a grand political scheme, as long as we still have this tendency to sin.
It's very Petersonian, start with yourself.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm still hoping that he finds the fullness of truth one of these days.
One hope.
And perhaps I should wrap it up. I mean, I think the conclusion to this is maybe actually G.K. Chesterton's a good transition, because reading Girard had predisposed me to feel somewhat positively about the Catholic Church, in spite of a lot of my reservations and all the reasons that Protestants will give you for why the Catholic Church is sort of illegitimate or no longer can claim the mantle of God's church on earth, that it's hopelessly corrupted, and that it uses priests and legalism to come between people and God. All these things that I had considered reasons not to become Catholic. Ultimately, what won out over that was the sense of a deposit of faith in orthodoxy that is sort of tested over time, that has, in some sense, in the Hayekian sense of spontaneous order, that has emerged or evolved in order to meet sort of I don't want to say the changing demands, because the great thing about orthodoxy is that ideally it's unchanging in what's essential, but things like confession and things like the teachings on marriage or contraception, or any of these things where we kind of need to have guidance or answers, and having gotten married in the last few years, and just sort of the enormity of that commitment, I think it really helps to have an institution that takes a fairly hard line on something like divorce and remarriage. That knowing that that's not an option, it actually strengthens the sense of commitment. So we're on these really practical things, I found that Catholicism kind of had the upper hand, and so that allowed me to kind of table some of my other objections to things like papal infallibility, and also just not only the corruption of the church throughout the ages, but this problem that is happening in almost all of Christianity, and including the Catholic Church today, which is the encroaching woke politics that sort of silences oftentimes the real Orthodox voices within the church in favor of something that's more popular to a small but very vocal minority.
So what motivated you the first time you stepped through the doors of a Catholic church in Berkeley? Like, how did you like work up the decision to do that?
I'm trying to remember if it was the Newman Center, which was right next door to where I was living. I was, again, this is sort of my strung out period, and I was living in a little unit that was built next to a house that I'd lived in college. My landlord was generous enough to let me live, I think, rent free. I would just, bring him wine, and he let me live in this little room that was called the dumpster, because it was roughly the dimensions of a dumpster, and it was located in a spot where there used to actually be a dumpster when I was in school. So I was living in the dumpster, and the Newman Center was right next door, and they offered daily mass at noon. And so I was probably just bored or struggling with something, and thought, this isn't going to be the worst use of my time. I'm just going to go and pray and sit through the mass. This story really, I think, probably would take too long to unpack in all of its details. And I'm afraid that I might be hindering the nap happening behind me. Sorry. So we might have to wrap it up. No worries. But
sorry, I should have kept things a little briefer earlier. This is juicy, but maybe give us a short version.
Okay, so the short version would be, I think the beauty of the liturgy. I started going to St. Dominic's in San Francisco on Sundays. I would go to the city for my job, and would be finished up right around the time that this mass was starting. And St. Dominic's on Bush Street in San Francisco is a beautiful old cathedral run by the Dominicans. And they're a preaching order, so they always had really, thick, meaty homilies. Not long, but just dense, and in a good way. And professional choirs and beautiful stained glass, and that kind of gave me a sense that there was hope, even for someone who had fallen away, as it were. And I did struggle for a long time with the fact that my baptism had not been the last word, that Satan, with all of his wiles, was able to insinuate himself back into my psyche, and seemed to be sort of winning for a little while. But I think that that this was my next conversion to Catholicism. That was sort of it wasn't like this is my last chance. It was more like, okay, now here's a new framework that both set me on a firmer footing and also gave me this idea of confession. And there was what led me into both the 12 steps and probably going to mass regularly was that I had at one point tried to go to confession even without being Catholic. And the priest generously heard my confession, and recommended at the end of it that I seek out a 12-step program, which I did. And that priest actually ended up being the same priest who confirmed me in the Catholic Church, and then also who married me and my wife a couple of years ago.
Glory to God. Yeah, I think there is something about, one thing I'm taking away from this whole narrative is like when someone comes to faith through a Protestant church, especially if they're like us and move a lot, like in this sort of atomized modern existence, you might have a very good church, but when you move to a new place, it can be hard to discern like what the new church for you to go to is, because you might not have a denominational commitment, and there's a way it feels like for the Catholic or the Orthodox, you have a little bit more of an army at your back, and like you know where the units are to join up, like when you go to a new place. And there are like some more of these spiritual sacraments for us to lean on, like confession, which can be the equivalence in the Protestant churches seems like a little bit more just variable. Like you don't know what you're going to get depending on where you're going. That's my opinion, what I'm taking away.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know of any Protestant churches that offer confession per se, I think that, in some contexts, it might be more encouraged to, confess your sins before the congregation, which seems a little bit daunting, and just seems like, the role of a priest in hearing confessions and administering absolution is really kind of I don't know if it's kind of an innovation. I think I once heard a priest kind of lay out the evolution of confession. And, it used to be that it was something very rare. It was like, maybe you had one opportunity after baptism, if you committed a grave sin, to confess before the community and be issued a penance, which would actually be a real penance, not like the penances that they give today of, say 5 Hail Marys or an Our Father or something. And it kind of gradually evolved to account for more, of a maintenance or housekeeping in a way. And for better or for worse, I think that it's worked for me. Like there have been certain persistent sins that I can honestly say have lessened and no longer oppress me in the same way that they did because of a recurring act of contrition.
Yeah, it also strikes me that when you get baptized, we say in the Orthodox Church there's a very stark. I mean, it sounds very similar where you renounce the devil and you align yourself with Christ, and we say like you're picking a war with the devil. So like don't think that it's the end of your spiritual struggle. It's actually something of a midpoint of your spiritual struggle. Like you will have Christ and your guardian angel and the saints on your side, so you have very powerful allies. But the devil will attack you after you're baptized.
It's true, and toward that end, we all need to be praying for each other. And my guardian angel is still got him working overtime. So thanks. So thanks be to God, and thanks be to my guardian angel.
I don't want to keep you too long. I feel like I could ask you one more question. It could just and we could accept that as happily ever after, which is, how did you eventually make the decision to be confirmed in the Catholic Church?
Well, this was a tough one because I really struggled with it right up to the last minute, meaning like standing outside the church on the night of that Easter vigil. I wasn't entirely sure that I was going to go through those doors. And earlier that day, a couple of interesting things happened to me that I look back on as being sort of, supernatural graces that enabled me to cross the Tiber. And one of them was that I had been driving up from where I was living at the time. I was living on my boat, actually. And I was driving up to the church to make my first confession so that I could receive communion. And this was with the same priest, actually, that I had previously made that informal, non-sacramental confession to. And on my way up, about halfway to the church, I see someone crossing the street who looked familiar, and I realized that it was my now wife, who I had messaged with on a Catholic dating site that I'd signed up for, kind of in anticipation, checking out, like, well, if I'm going to join the Catholic Church, let's see what's going on their dating website. And we had exchanged a few messages, but it hadn't really gone anywhere. She didn't have the paid account where she couldn't send messages back, so she tried to send me a code with emojis, and I just kind of let that chill. But I recognized her from the hat that she was wearing in one of the pictures, Boston Red Sox hat. And so I rolled down my window and was like, "Are you Emma by any chance?" And she kind of, taken aback, but I said, "Hold on a second." And I parked and got out and came over and introduced myself as the guy from Catholic Match. And so then I got her phone number, and that kind of seemed like a little bit of a wink. One of
well,
God's
you can't
winks.
back out now. Like now that you're,
right, exactly.
Then things are going well with this girl.
Yeah, and then I made that confession. There was also, I had picked out my patron saint, or rather, I think my patron saint kind of picked me out, and it was James, the book of James. which is a really interesting letter toward the very end. I think it's like 2 books before Revelation, James, Jude, and then Revelation. Maybe the Johannine epistles are also in there. But James was a cousin or brother-in-law, something of close relative of Jesus, who was very highly regarded in the church in Jerusalem, kind of considered the pillar of the church. And he's sort of hated by a lot of Protestants because he emphasizes not justification by works, but he says that, if you have faith, then it will manifest itself in the form of good works. And I think that this is an area where, Protestantism sometimes falls short in its exclusive focus on, solo fide, so through faith alone. And I think that there is something to a kind of that if your faith is authentic, it will be demonstrated through certain works, as it were. I don't really know what the tie-in is there to Catholicism, but I do feel like that's sort of something. James represents a little bit of a rebuke to a common strand of Protestantism. And then the last thing, just before the Mass, I went up to the Graduate Theological Union. This is going to be the last thing that I say here, because I hear it in the background.
I hear your child, yeah.
There was a woman who was studying at the GTU, and we got into this conversation where this was kind of like the one of the little bit of spiritual warfare, because she starts telling me about all the stories she knows about priests who were, sort of thoroughly corrupted and who were, living in sin, the worst kinds of sin, and then turning around and saying Mass, talking about, all the abuse scandals, and wondering how I could possibly be Catholic. And it turned out that she was studying to become, at the GTU, she was studying to become a minister of some kind of syncretistic religion that practices animal sacrifice and like pagan witchcraft and all this weird stuff. So I kind of, after that conversation, I was kind of like, whatever that is, I think I just want to go in the opposite direction. And so I did end up getting confirmed that night, but it was a little bit of a struggle, and it took some time to kind of ease into becoming Catholic. And it still is a journey where I'm discovering what it means. But if we ever have another conversation, I can tell you all about my pilgrimage to Ireland and some of the other things that, since my becoming Catholic, have helped solidify that as an identity that I feel comfortable in. So, not always comfortable, but feel like it's the right place to be.
And that was in Pope Francis's Year of Mercy?
2015, the year before I was, maybe even 2 years before I was, 2016, I think 2016,
okay.
And the year after.
Okay. Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time, Charlie, and I thank you for your forbearance and being willing to finish this out with me. You've been very generous, and thank you for your story. I hope it's inspiring and informative to lots of people out there who might be in a similar boat. Maybe literally in your case, since you've lived, since you have a boat.
Yeah, come out to the Bay Area and we'll go sailing.
All right. Well, I appreciate it, Charlie, and I'll let you go.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. I really enjoyed it.